Welcome, dear friends, and gather around as I share with you a tale that will warm your heart and lift your spirits. It's a story about a woman's unexpected journey, where the past and present intertwine to create a future filled with hope, healing, and the gifts of love. Enjoy the story.
The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the sprawling fields as Rachel Parker pulled into the long, winding driveway that led to her family's estate. It had been years since she last visited, and the sight of the familiar oak trees lining the path brought a mix of emotions bubbling to the surface. Once a place of comfort and warmth, the house now stood as a looming reminder of a past she had spent the better part of a decade trying to forget. Rachel parked her car and sat for a moment, staring at the large, Victorian-style house that had been her childhood home. The letter she had received a week ago was still clutched in her hand, the creases worn from being read and reread. It was from a law firm she had never heard of, informing her that her grandmother, Margaret, had passed away and left her the estate. It was a shock, to say the least. Rachel had barely spoken to her grandmother since her mother's death when she was a teenager. Their relationship had always been strained, and Rachel had left home as soon as she was able, vowing never to return. But now, here she was, standing at the threshold of a past she thought she had left behind. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, as she stepped out of the car and walked up the front steps. The door creaked open under her touch, revealing a dark, musty interior. She flicked on the light, and the hallway was bathed in a dim, yellow glow. Dust motes danced in the air, and the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories filled her nostrils. Rachel hesitated in the doorway, her heart pounding. The last time she had walked through these halls, she had been a grieving teenager, desperate to escape the suffocating sadness that had enveloped her after her mother's sudden death. Margaret had been cold and distant, more interested in preserving the family's reputation than in comforting her granddaughter. The years that followed had only deepened the rift between them, with Rachel moving far away and cutting off nearly all contact. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft thud. The house was as she remembered it, large, imposing, and filled with an air of melancholy. The furniture was old, the walls lined with paintings of long-dead ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her as she walked down the hallway. It was a house that held secrets, and Rachel felt an unease settle over her as she made her way to the living room. The room was just as she remembered, dark, with heavy drapes covering the windows and a large fireplace dominating one wall. The furniture was covered in dust, and the air was thick with the scent of stale memories. She ran her fingers over the mantel, disturbing a layer of dust, and sighed. This house was the last place she wanted to be, but she knew she had to go through with it. There were legalities to take care of, and she needed to decide what to do with the estate. As she stood in the middle of the room, her eyes were drawn to a small, ornate box sitting on the coffee table. It hadn't been there before. Of that she was sure. Curious, she walked over and picked it up. The box was made of dark wood, intricately carved with swirling patterns, and it felt surprisingly heavy in her hands. She opened it slowly, half expecting it to be empty, but instead found a stack of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she untied the ribbon and pulled out the first letter. The handwriting was familiar, though shakier than she remembered, her grandmother's. She sat down on the couch, her hands trembling as she unfolded the letter. "My dearest Rachel," it began. Rachel blinked in surprise. It was rare for Margaret to use such endearing terms, especially with her. She continued reading, the words pulling her deeper into the letter. "I know this letter may come as a shock to you, as we have been estranged for so long. I have lived with many regrets, but none more so than the distance that has grown between us. I know I have not been the grandmother you needed, especially after your mother's death. My grief was overwhelming, and I did not know how to comfort you when I could barely comfort myself. I am writing this letter because there are things you need to know, things I should have told you years ago. Our family has many secrets, and I fear that if I do not tell you, they will be lost forever. But more importantly, I want you to understand the choices I made and the reasons behind them. You deserve to know the truth, and I hope that in some small way it will help to heal the wounds between us. I am leaving you this estate, not as a burden, but as a gift. There is more to this place than meets the eye, and I believe that in time you will come to see it as a home, just as I did. I only ask that you keep an open mind and heart as you read these letters. They contain my deepest thoughts and feelings, and I hope they will bring you some comfort, even if it is long overdue. With all my love, Margaret. Rachel sat back, her mind reeling. She had never known her grandmother to be so vulnerable, so open. The woman she had known had always been reserved, almost cold, never one to show emotion. Yet here, in these letters, was a side of her grandmother she had never seen, a side that seemed to be reaching out to her across the years, trying to bridge the gap that had grown between them. She picked up the next letter, eager to learn more. As she read, she found herself drawn into the story of her grandmother's life, a life that had been far more complex and difficult than she had ever imagined. Margaret had grown up in the same house, inheriting it from her parents, who had been strict and distant. She had married young, to a man who was kind, but also deeply troubled, struggling with his demons. Their marriage had been difficult, and they had lost their first child, a tragedy that had nearly destroyed them both. Rachel read on, learning about the early years of her mother's life, the joy Margaret had felt when she was born, the deep love she had for her, and the sorrow that had followed when her husband's health began to decline. Margaret had been forced to take on the role of caregiver, a role that had consumed her and left little room for anything else. By the time Rachel's mother was a teenager, Margaret was a shadow of her former self, weighed down by the responsibilities of caring for a sick husband and running the household. The letters spoke of the strain this had put on Margaret's relationship with her daughter, and how she had often been too strict, too controlling, out of fear of losing her as she had lost so much already. Rachel's mother had rebelled, leading to frequent arguments and a growing rift between them. But beneath it all, Margaret's love for her daughter had never wavered, even as their relationship became more strained. As Rachel read the final letter in the stack, tears streamed down her face. Margaret had poured her heart into these letters, sharing her deepest regrets and the love she had for both Rachel and her mother. She had never meant to push Rachel away, but her grief and fears had clouded her judgment, leading to the distance that had grown between them. Rachel sat in the silent house, the letters spread out around her, feeling a profound sense of loss, but also a glimmer of hope. Her grandmother had been far from perfect, but she had tried in her way to make amends. The letters were a gift, a chance to understand the woman who had shaped her life in so many ways. The next morning, Rachel woke early, the events of the previous day still fresh in her mind. She felt a strange sense of determination as she got dressed and made her way downstairs. The house felt different now, less imposing, more familiar. She had spent so many years running from her past, from the pain of her mother's death and the strained relationship with her grandmother. But now, standing in the house that had been her family's for generations, she felt a pull to stay, to understand more about where she came from and what had been left to her. Over the next few days, Rachel began the daunting task of sorting through the house. Each room held memories, some painful, others bittersweet. As she went through drawers and closets, she found more letters, hidden in books, tucked away in boxes, and even slipped between the pages of her grandmother's old Bible. Each one added another layer to the story of Margaret's life. And with each new discovery, Rachel felt her heart soften toward the woman she had once viewed as distant and uncaring. She spent hours in the attic, where she found trunks filled with old photographs, diaries, and other keepsakes. One day, as she was sifting through a box of her mother's belongings, she came across a small leather-bound journal. The cover was worn and the pages yellowed with age. Rachel hesitated for a moment before opening it, unsure if she was ready to delve into her mother's private thoughts. But curiosity won out, and she began to read. The journal was a revelation. It chronicled her mother's life from the time she was a young girl, through her teenage years, and up until a few months before her death. The entries were raw and honest, filled with the hopes, dreams, and fears of a woman Rachel had loved deeply but had never truly understood. Her mother had been a vibrant, passionate woman, full of life and ambition, but she had also been deeply conflicted, struggling with the expectations placed on her by her family and society. Rachel read through the entries, feeling a deep connection to the woman her mother had been. She learned about her mother's dreams of becoming an artist, her struggles with depression, and the complicated relationship she had with Margaret. The journal painted a picture of a woman who had been caught between duty and desire, trying to navigate the complexities of family and personal fulfillment. As Rachel reached the final entries, she felt a sense of foreboding. The tone of the journal had shifted, becoming darker, more melancholic. Her mother had written about feeling trapped, about the weight of expectations crushing her spirit. She had written about her longing for freedom, for a life that was her own. But there was also a deep love for Rachel, a fierce protectiveness that came through in every word. The last entry was dated just a week before her mother's death. It was short, just a few lines, but it broke Rachel's heart. "I don't know how much longer I can do this. The weight is too much and I feel like I'm drowning. But I have to keep going for Rachel. She is my light, my reason for being. I just hope she knows how much I love her, even if I can't always show it." Rachel closed the journal, her hands shaking. She had always known that her mother had struggled, but seeing it laid out so plainly, in her own words, was almost too much to bear. She sat in the attic for a long time, staring at the journal, her mind racing. Her mother had loved her and had tried to be strong for her, but in the end, the weight of her own struggles had been too much. The journal was a stark reminder of the toll that unfulfilled dreams and unspoken pain could take on a person's life. But it was also a testament to the love her mother had for her, a love that had been the driving force behind everything she did. Rachel felt a deep sense of responsibility as she sat there, surrounded by the remnants of her family's past. She had inherited more than just the house. She had inherited their dreams, their hopes, and their struggles. And now, it was up to her to carry those forward, to build a life that honored the legacy they had left behind. In the days that followed, Rachel threw herself into the work of restoring the house. It was a labor of love, a way to connect with her family and to create something beautiful out of the pain of the past. She hired contractors to help with the renovations, but she also spent hours doing the work herself, painting walls, sanding floors, and planting a new garden in the backyard. The house was slowly transformed, becoming a place of light and warmth, a true home. As she worked, Rachel found herself thinking more and more about her grandmother and her mother. She had spent so many years resenting them, blaming them for the pain she had experienced. But now, as she learned more about their lives, she felt a deep sense of empathy and understanding. They had done the best they could with the lives they had been given, and they had loved her in their ways. One evening, as she was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset over the fields, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The house was nearly finished, and it was everything she had hoped it would be. It was a place where she could build a new life, one filled with love, happiness, and fulfillment. But there was still one more thing she needed to do. The next morning, Rachel drove into town and visited the local library. She had done some research and found that there were still a few people in town who had known her family, old friends of her grandmother, people who might be able to fill in the gaps in the story. She spent the day talking to them, learning more about her family's history and the impact they had had on the community. One person, in particular, stood out, a woman named Helen, who had been Margaret's closest friend. Helen was in her 80s now, but she was still sharp and full of energy. She invited Rachel into her home and shared stories about Margaret that Rachel had never heard before, stories of kindness, generosity, and a deep love for her family. Helen spoke of how Margaret had struggled after the death of her husband, how she had thrown herself into charity work as a way to cope with her grief. But there was one story that struck Rachel the most. "Your grandmother was always so proud of you," Helen said, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "She used to talk about you all the time, how smart and strong you were. She wanted so badly to mend things between you two, but she didn't know how. She was afraid, I think. Afraid that you wouldn't forgive her, that it was too late." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought she didn't care." Helen reached out and took her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Oh, she cared, dear. She cared more than you could ever know. She just didn't know how to show it. But she loved you, Rachel. She loved you with all her heart." As Rachel drove back to the house that evening, Helen's words echoed in her mind. Her grandmother had loved her, even if she hadn't known how to show it. And her mother had loved her too, despite the struggles she had faced. The love of her family was a thread that ran through the generations, binding them together even in the face of pain and loss. When she arrived home, Rachel sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out the letters her grandmother had written. She read them again, this time with a new understanding. a new perspective. The letters were filled with love, regret, and hope that Rachel could find the happiness that had eluded her grandmother and mother. And Rachel knew, with a certainty that she hadn't felt in years, that she would. Over the next few months, Rachel continued to build her new life. She started a small business selling handmade crafts and home goods, and began volunteering at the local community center. She made new friends, reconnected with old ones, and slowly but surely she began to heal. The house was finished just in time for the holidays, and Rachel decided to host a Christmas party for her new friends and neighbors. It was a beautiful, joyful celebration, filled with laughter, music, and warmth. As Rachel stood in the living room watching her guests enjoy the home she had created, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what her grandmother had wanted for her, this happiness, this sense of belonging. And it was what her mother had wanted too. They had both given her the strength and the love to build this new life, and she would carry that with her, always. As the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Rachel stepped outside onto the porch, the cold winter air biting at her cheeks. She looked up at the stars, the night sky clear and bright, and felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Her journey had been long and difficult, filled with pain and loss, but it had also been filled with love, with hope, and with the gifts her family had left her. The house, the letters, the stories, they were all part of her now, part of the legacy she would carry forward. And as she stood there, gazing at the stars, Rachel knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be.